Ernie, outside of Ontario, has a question. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. What is the New Testament that Paul is a minister of? I thought we were not under the New Covenant. I'm a little confused. Thanks, Ernie. Back to this question about the New Covenant. I appreciate that. And let's look. And the question, if I can summarize that, is... what New Testament is referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6? 2 Corinthians 3, verse 6. What is this New Testament in my blood? Now, as we read this, let me read the scripture here. Who hath made us, speaking of God, who hath made us able ministers of the New Testament. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. Now, certainly, indeed, is a great question here. And the New Testament that is given here, let me just say a word about this word that is given as testament in verse 6. And I want to give you that, diadakos is the word. It is the word for covenant. And Paul speaks to the Corinthians. I've been teaching 1 Corinthians on Thursday nights, and if you followed along with that, it is my belief that the Corinthian church was what we today would call a Messianic Jewish congregation. They were believers in Jesus as Messiah, living in the age of grace, but it was a Jewish congregation. So lots of Jewish references in 1 and 2 Corinthians. And in fact, down in verse 13, it says, and not as Moses, which put a veil over his face. So many Old Testament Jewish references that would obviously be very appropriate for a Jewish congregation, a Messianic Jewish congregation. So when Paul comes here, again in verse 6, and says, we are able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter killeth, the Spirit giveth life, I think that he's saying a couple things. One is that among those Jewish people, they are teaching the kingdom, and he's got some kingdom terminology too among the Corinthians. And if we're not in the kingdom, which I also believe we're not yet in the kingdom, why is he talking about some of this kingdom stuff? And it's because of the nature of who the congregation is. So here he says, we're ministers of the New Testament. I'm going to use the word covenant for just a moment here. And I'll come back to testament in a moment. We're ministers of the new covenant. But he says, not of the letter. Now, I think this is a good indication that he's saying, look, if you go by the letter, we're not in the new covenant. So we understand this. But we're ministers of the new covenant. Minister the word is diakonos. Deacons is one of the sense we get that. But it's servants of this new covenant. Now, Paul, ministering in this Jewish Messianic congregation, is guiding that Jewish Messianic congregation, I think, to the days of the New Covenant. And as we work with Jewish people, there's a sense in which I think you and I can even say we are ministers, servants of a new covenant with the one who is the mediator between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. We're servants of Christ, who is the mediator of the New Covenant. And the word testament, by the way, is a word that came in with Jerome. As you come between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew, it says New Testament. Now, Jerome the Catholic put that in there. I think that that it's wrong on many accounts, in that the new covenant, even if it didn't start until at the end of the Gospels with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So really, you have nothing changed theologically in the Gospels that you didn't have in the Old Testament. They were still living under the law. They were still very much under the Old Covenant. It was later that Jesus became the mediator of the New Covenant, which is going to be given to the whole house of Israel. So Paul, when he when he says, "I wish I could be a curse on behalf of my people," and all the passion that he has for the Jewish people, I think it's in this regard that he is a minister or a servant of of the New Testament, not of the letter, because it's not here in letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter killeth and the Spirit giveth life. It's a difficult question, and I would just freely admit, for full disclosure, it's one of the more difficult scriptures as it relates to my position that says we're not under the new covenant. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. And Tammy, thank you. It's a hyperbaric chamber is what I was trying to say earlier. And to go back to that new covenant question, Ernie says, so it has nothing to do with Jeremiah 31:31. I think it does. It's just that even Paul is saying, I'm just a servant of this New Testament or New Covenant, and not of the letter, because it's not here in letter, but in spirit. I'm a servant for this Corinthian Jewish believing congregation. We're working together to get the Jewish nation to come to the point of acceptance of Jesus as Messiah, so that the new covenant in letter can be established. Good question.